We also have present with us today Dr. James Lyons-Weiler. And if you have documents to be circulated, we can make sure that, thank you. Again, I'd ask you to provide an introduction for the record and remind you that we have 30 minutes. How you choose to use the 30 minutes is entirely up to you. What has been recommended is a 20-minute presentation to allow for 10 minutes of questions, but if you would prefer to avoid questions, then that is up to you.
Thank you very much. I'd actually prefer to have more of a dialogue. So I would like to state up front that I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to step forward and share some things with you. I can't say whether I'm for or against the bill. I run a not-for-profit out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I'm here on my own expense. Not going to seek, nor have I accepted or been offered any compensation for my presence here. I grew up across the river in Ogdensburg, New York, looking at Canada every day of my childhood, and I come from a northern enough country where your sensibilities are part of my upbringing. I watched your television, and I wear socks when I wear sandals. So people don't get that. I've traveled all around the country educating legislators about why a 100% mandate vaccine doesn't make any biological or scientific sense. There are people, I'm a lifelong biomedical researcher. I think you'll get to know me a little bit through my comment, which I really want to go through quickly, and please do, let me know when it's 15 minutes so we can talk a little. Thank you. There are people across the globe who, for no fault of their own, have a genetic predisposition to diseases like Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. There is clear science and evidence that some people who, due to genetics, cannot tolerate some medicines. Nowhere in the practice of medicine, nor in public health policies, are these individuals singled out and castigated for making decisions to opt out of particular treatments based on their personal experience on past adverse reactions to these medicines, witnessed by themselves and witnessed by their doctors, except when it comes to vaccines. There, the science and evidence in support of risk is not listened to. When a mother witnesses their child develop a fever and then for the first time develop seizures, or a harrowing encephalitic cry for the first time start banging their head against the ground repeatedly all night long, and the only change in that child's life that day was a trip to the pediatrician's office for a well child visit to receive a vaccine, a caring and compassionate medicine would have some way to calm down the microglia activation that is occurring due to toxins in the environment. When a child experiences a blow to the head, the severity of the brain injury due to concussion can be reduced by a treatment that depletes glutamate in the blood. So the excess glutamate in the brain can spill into the blood. If the microgliosis instead occurs after vaccination, parents are not met with a compassionate medicine. They are met with the denialist agenda, and they are told it was not the vaccine. They are told it's normal and to let the infant or the baby cry it out. They are abandoned by medicine. In an era in which information was controlled by the media, heavily influenced by governments, the population of nations around the world would accept the denialist party line. Then came social media, and parents around the world who did not accept the denialist party line found each other. People from all walks of life, from stay-at-home moms to teachers, bakers, scientists, all found that their stories matched, event for event. And over 90% of the stories involved either the DTaP vaccine or the MMR vaccine. Correlation does not equal causation, they were told. No credible study has ever found an association between vaccines and autism, they were told. I'm a lifelong biomedical research scientist, and I pride myself on objectivity. I was the founding editor-in-chief of the journal Cancer Informatics, full faculty at the University of Pittsburgh Cancer Institute, research scientist and scientific director of the University of Pittsburgh Bioinformatics Analysis Core. I recently founded and launched a new open-access peer-reviewed journal called Science, Public Health Policy, and the Law. I am an expert in translational research, from basic research to bench to bedside and back, expert in multivariate data analysis and prediction modeling and biological pathways underlying the causes of disease. I made a name for myself in the area of cancer biomarker research, in the early detection of cancer, and developing ways to predict when patients will experience adverse events from chemotherapy. I've written 3 books based on science and evidence. This is the second book that brought me here today. I became interested in the social dynamics of science, asking questions about how, after all the pressures of science to produce revenue and profit, could actual knowledge come forward and be translated into best practices of medicine after medicine became a for-profit industry. When I decided to write a chapter on vaccines in this book, I expected to find all the science that we're told exists. I used to lecture my sister with her 10 kids who were all unvaccinated that she was going to destroy the world. That was me. I was that guy, okay? But when I went to the scientific literature, what I found there was, it really stunned me. What I expected were these randomized prospective clinical trials, and I expected every vaccine to be tested, and I expected when a vaccine was added to the schedule that it would be tested against a placebo, that the schedule would be tested against a placebo, because the clinical question is, should I vaccinate my child? Should I use some vaccines? All these clinical questions. But what I found instead stunned me, because what I found were very weak science correlation studies. Studies that were conducted that initially found associations between vaccines and autism, vaccines and seizures, vaccines and autoimmunity. But then what the researchers did would have cost me my job at the University of Pittsburgh. I designed research studies, over 100 research studies, under the direction of Dr. Ronald Huberman at the Cancer Center and Dr. Art Levine in the School of Medicine. If I found an association, say, between a chemotherapy agent and an adverse reaction, and then I decided to reanalyze the data until I could make that association go away, if there was a corrupt scientist or a medical person that wanted to profit from that chemotherapy agent, they might like me, but I would have lost my job. And this is what I found in not just one study, in study after study after study. They would find an association, and then they would analyze it. In one case, they found an association between the total number of vaccines that a child had received and the incidence of any neurodevelopmental disorder, including autism. They then spent 4 years reanalyzing those data until they found a way, finally, to make an association go away. And there's a letter from the data analyst saying, it just won't go away, talking about the association. And he pleaded in his letter, in the name of objectivity, in the name of science, we really need to be able to publish this, please, to the CDC, the US CDC. Imagine my dismay. What do I do with this? I decided to remain objective. I decided to remain a scientist, and I put that story in my book on cures versus profits. I'm not trying to sell a book here. The sales are miserable, but that's not the point. The scientists involved in this were Dr. Colleen Boyle, Dr. Frank DiStefano, and others at the US CDC. Dr. Boyle and DiStefano, I found out later, are the same scientists responsible for finding that Agent Orange posed no risks to US soldiers serving in Vietnam. Same people, same exact 2 people. Prior to reporting the results of one of the studies to the Institutes of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences, he was scheduled to make that report. Dr. William Thompson attempted to bring these issues to the attention of Dr. Julie Gerberding, who was the director of the Vaccine Science Division at the CDC at the time. Dr. Gerberding now holds a key position at Merck. Dr. Thompson was told he had mental issues, and he was put on administrative leave, while Dr. DiStefano took the altered results of the study and excluded the results showing association between on-time MMR vaccination and autism. My response on these matters, which were brought forward by Dr. Brian Hooker in the form of audio recordings of the confessions by Dr. Thompson, was not to accept that vaccines cause autism. Just because the CDC found a mild association or a possible association doesn't mean that vaccines cause autism. I wanted to know, given my expertise in biomedical research and the pathophysiology of disease, could there possibly be some way that vaccines cause autism? So I read over 2,000 studies, not on vaccines, on autism, to determine whether or not the basic science could support a pathophysiological mechanism by which vaccines could possibly cause autism, the plausibility question, right? I have since formally evaluated all of the 48, I think there were studies sent to the President of the United States by the American Academy of Pediatrics with an objective evaluation scoring system to determine how far away are they from the gold standard that you were told about earlier, the randomized clinical trial, prospective randomized clinical trial, the highest score that these studies can get are a positive 12. The average study used by the CDC to tell the public that, and by the AAP now, that vaccines do not cause autism was a negative 6. How much time, please? Okay. So you'll hear information about studies like fMRI scans that show that vaccines can't cause autism because kids early on show changes in their brain structures. But that's in a population of moms who are getting 2 vaccines during pregnancy, and all the children are receiving hepatitis B vaccine on day 1. So how can we say that the changes, early changes in the fMRI studies are not due to vaccines when in fact those individuals who are born with differences in their brain are vaccinated? And to me that could be a useful biomarker to predict who might not be able to tolerate vaccines as well as others. Well, I said that a lot longer than it took to write it. But you know, I dove into the vaccines. You saw the list of ingredients. The ones that concerned me the most, of course, are mercury. Contrary to Dr. Richard Pan, who recently stated in public there's no mercury in vaccines. Yes, there are. The flu vaccine contains thimerosal. Thimerosal inhibits a protein called ERAP1. ERAP1 protein actually folds proteins that our immune system needs to create the antigens to things that we already are immune to. The predicted effect of that is to forget what we're immune to and get an upper respiratory virus infection other than the flu, and that's exactly what Dr. Ben Cowling out of Hong Kong found. There's a problem with the use of thimerosal. Aluminum is a neurotoxin. There are studies, the studies, I have published a peer-reviewed publication on aluminum and its pediatric dosing, and it turns out that the science that the FDA used to say that aluminum is safe in children is actually not injected forms of aluminum into infant mice, as would be expected from the standards of basic research, but orally ingested forms of aluminum, which is a completely different type of aluminum, which the mice only absorb, and humans only absorb 0.03% of that dose, and those adults were mice. They didn't have to go through neurodevelopment. So how can we say we have no science whatsoever, no credible science shows that vaccination using aluminum-containing vaccines is safe for developing human or mouse or monkey brain or any kind of mammalian brain? So I'm sure it's been pointed out to you that CDC is incapable of tracking vaccine injury. The doctors, thank you, the doctors don't tell the patients that the vaccines cause the problem. They're supposed to report every single adverse health event that happens shortly after the vaccine to a system called VAERS. There was a system called AutoVAERS that was developed by Harvard Pilgrim Health. They found 100-fold vaccine, possibly vaccine-related adverse events, and they reported to the CDC, and they reported 2 or 3 times, and the CDC hung up and stopped calling. After spending $1 million to have them develop software to automate this system. So, in my opinion, it's my professional opinion that regulatory capture in the United States is complete. It's 100%. On numbers so far as risk from vaccines, I can tell you, this is CDC data prior to the introduction of the MMR. The death rate from measles was in the U.S. was 450 to 500 per year in a population of 180 million people. That is a tiny, tiny mortality risk. And you saw the data earlier. I think it's very important that 1985, at around 45–50% vaccine uptake, we didn't have people dying in the streets of measles. Measles is not Ebola. One of my books is Ebola, an evolving story. The problem is systematic denial of contraindications due to what I call, the hot potato of liability. There's a great Boston Law Review. I don't have the reference here, but I'll send it to somebody who can get it to you, by Efthymios Perisidis. He is a faculty member in the School of Law at Ohio State University. The history was bring on widespread vaccination in 1976. We see an increase in chronic illness in the United States since then, linear increase in that, and it's out of hand. But most importantly, in terms of liability, why is it important to get 100% right now? To me, I think it's that states don't want to have to pay. They know that the parents will pull the kids from school if you hold school, and so the states don't have to pay for the problem that they now hold the hot potato. And I very, very much feel for your position. It's a very difficult decision that you have ahead of you. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Rogerson.
Thank you for your presentation here. I'll try to be quick, but I do have a few questions. I want to understand first what your professional qualifications are. So I know you're doctor. Is it Ph.D. or medical doctor?
I'm a Ph.D. in evolution, conservation biology, and ecology, but I helped create the field of bioinformatics. So when new technology came about where we could measure 40,000 genes in a tumor at one time, I was on a Alfred P. Sloan Foundation fellowship, and I shifted my focus over to helping clinicians sort out those data and relate them to clinical features. So I have over 17 years of biomedical research experience under my belt.
Okay. And you mentioned a couple journals, one that you were the founding editor for. Are those peer-reviewed journals?
Absolutely.
Okay.
In fact, I led the I led the editorial board on a near revolt after somebody tried to corrupt the peer review process by having the authors submitting the papers to submit the paper and the review at the same time. And I threatened to the publisher that we were going to resign, and they folded. And so they adopted the gold standard of peer review. Very important to me.
I'm going to ask a question that I didn't plan to, but because of a few presentations, you're going to be the lucky one that gets the question. A few people are saying that, and you know, I've read it as well, that there's insufficient research or inconclusive research on either the link to harm or link to safety. Okay, so we'll talk causation or link, whatever. Mm-hmm. But there's insufficient research. I'm curious, why is somebody not doing that research?
It's a great question for me because I just received the data from Paul Thomas's study in Oregon. We're doing the vaccinated, unvaccinated study at the Institute for Pure and Applied Knowledge.
Is it long-term research? Or
it is. He has
research?
Over 1,500 patients. He has thousands, tens of thousands of patients, but we have 1,500 patients that were born into his practice over the last 10 years. So it's a retrospective study. It's not a randomized prospective study. But you know what I'm doing, instead of just measuring mere associations, I'm doing what you were told earlier. I'm trying to find out if we can find the variables that will allow us to predict who would have developed autoimmunity, who would have developed autism, or neurodevelopmental disorders. I heard somebody ask earlier, I think it was you actually, sorry I don't know your name, but is there something more that we can do about it? And the prediction modeling that I'm expert in can answer this question, which is if the mom has a family history, if the child had eczema, doctors used to never vaccinate. There used to be standard medical practice. If you vaccinate a child and they develop eczema, don't do it again, something terrible is going to happen. They don't do that anymore. They say, oh, there's no association. But guess what? There's never been a single study that asks the question, is there association of autism in kids that developed eczema? So they can't do every possible study, right?
This seems like a big missing link, though, if there's... Anyway, I'll ask one more question, because I know there's a lot of others that have questions, too. But I'm curious, too, about, you know, the different treatment of vaccine versus drugs when it comes to proving the safety before use. What's your perspective on why that might be? Why isn't a vaccine treated similar to a drug?
The difference between biologics and vaccines and the way that drugs are treated in translational research is due to the history of adverse events from vaccines. So there are so many adverse events that the population was, in fact, suing the vaccine developers, and they went to the U.S. government and said, we're going under, you have to help us. And then the government said, go to your insurance companies. The insurance companies said, we don't want this is too much, it'll break us. So then they went back to the government, and they created the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which I am a compensated expert witness in on behalf of patients who are vaccine injured, so I can bring in the mechanisms of pathophysiology. It is a system that definitely needs reform because they had an omnibus proceeding. The history is complex, but they said, let's look at 5,000 cases of autism, see if there's any way that there could be autism. And the very first case that they found, they ruled in favor of autism and vaccines, and then they kicked that case out of the omnibus proceedings. There were 5 cases. and then they replaced it with another one. This is the denialist agenda. Their fear is that people will stop vaccinating their children. But instead, without liability protection, with liability protection, the vaccine manufacturers have zero incentive to make their product better. If there was a car seat that caused encephalopathy, it would take 1 or 2 cases. Sears Roebuck, 2 years ago, made a table saw that was on a wheelbarrow. And 3 people cut their fingers on it, and they pulled the product. Okay, we need to close the loop. It's a feedback, quality control feedback that is broken in this system, that we absolutely desperately need that.
Thank you.
Savoy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Please forgive me. This question may have been already asked, and I may be asking it of you twice, but I just want to be clear. So you've written 3 books based on science and evidence. Were these books that are available like in a bookstore, or are these scientific papers?
Well, I have over 50 peer-reviewed publications myself, but the books that I wrote are compilations of peer-reviewed scientific publications.
Okay.
One's on Ebola, one's called Cures versus Profits. It goes into 18 different topics in biomedical research with interviews of primary researchers, and the other one is the environmental and genetic causes of autism, which I cite over 1,000 peer-reviewed publications.
Okay, so they've been peer-reviewed, by organizations like the Lancet, so on and so forth, those kinds of...
Books are not typically peer-reviewed.
Okay, all right, good. So, again, you're an American citizen. Everything that you've referenced so far has been about the CDC, American actions, the actions of doctors, the actions of the American system. We are a sovereign nation. We have our own Health Canada.
Yes,
when
you do.
a drug comes out, our own doctors make their assertions on the efficacy and safety of that drug or that vaccine, whatever we want to talk about. Everything that you've talked about here doesn't help me in the province of New Brunswick. Are you aware of any Canadian studies that would deal similarly with what you have dealt with here? Are you aware of any Canadian studies that deal similarly with the things that you allege with the CDC and doctors and everything in America?
Yes, I would refer you to Dr. Christopher Shaw and his peer-reviewed publication research on encephalopathy and other problems caused by vaccination ingredients in mice.
Is he a Canadian doctor that practices in Canada?
He's a Canadian researcher, a Ph.D. researcher. Yeah.
Okay. Why are you not referencing that material instead of something out of the CDC in America?
I mean no offense whatsoever. However, most of the science that is published on the question that I'm concerned with and what I'm experienced with and what I'm familiar with comes out from the CDC, which contracted to, most of that science went over to Denmark. So most of what it's not coming from the United States. It's coming from contracted work from the CDC to scientists in Denmark. So thanks for the opportunity for clarification.
Well, again, I'm looking for more information that's going to help us make a decision on a law here in New Brunswick, so I'd be looking for relevant Canadian content. That's what I would like to hear more of rather than American experience.
I know exactly where you're coming from, and I appreciate that. If you'd like me to get back to you in a day or so, I'll be happy to do so.
Thank you. Ms. Minton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here today. I have 2 quick questions. One, and forgive me if you already addressed this, I was wondering who invited you to come, or how did you hear about this committee?
The name of the person who invited me was Cheryl Yacom. I believe she's involved with, and a couple of others, I believe she's involved with Canadians for Vaccine Choice, or an organization like that.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. The other question I had is related to something on the last page of your presentation, talking about how no randomized prospective clinical trials had been done with the vaccines versus placebo. And I was wondering if you could speak to, if you know why these are not done. Is it to do with ethical considerations of not vaccinating? Or,
so the explanation that's given why it's so-called unethical, it's considered unethical to do a randomized trial, is that you're denying vaccines to the arm of children who wouldn't get vaccines. However, the randomized prospective clinical trials that Merck did on the HPV vaccine did include unvaccinated. They were given the aluminum adjuvant instead of a saline placebo, but they were denied the vaccine, and they vaccinated them at the end of the study. And so the answer to the ethical question about why randomized clinical trials can't be done is that you can vaccinate them at the end of the study. That's the answer. If it's that important, I mean, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
That's all.
Madam Chair, the question I was asked, Mr. Savoy, so I yield.
We do have a few more minutes. If there are more questions, we'll circle around. Ms. Rogers?
Yep. I could just ask one question. You mentioned that in your experience, in your study, you would find a linear increase in chronic illness after the widespread adoption of immunization in 1976. How is it you would link those two and not other causal factors?
Oh, it's kind of impossible to do that. There's so many moving factors, and that's the problem with observational studies. However, one of the tenets of causal analysis, right, is temporal association. And the specific analysis that I did involved looking at the number of studies that mention diseases of unknown origin, mysterious diseases that nobody knows the cause of, and then correcting for the total number of publications per year. And what happens is from 1900 until 1976, when they brought on the swine flu vaccination, it's exactly flat. And from that point in time on, it increases. The United States, and I'm sorry to appear parochial in my comments, but I'm speaking from where I know, the United States has the highest first-day death rate of mothers, and we don't know why. It has, increasing massive, 54% of kids have a chronic illness, and we don't know why. And yet we say we have the best biomedical system, but we don't know what causes all this chronic illness. Where's all the autoimmune diabetes coming from? Some of the analysis that I've done myself, and I can speak to myself, is that we cause autoimmunity and chronic illness in animals to study drugs to treat those illnesses using aluminum hydroxide. It's the same compound that we're injecting in our children. Now, detractors will say it takes 10,000 to 20,000 times the dose to get, lupus or other autoimmunity conditions. But if you actually look at the math like I did and correct for body weight and look at the doses, if the mice have a genetic predisposition to autoimmunity, you only need 5 times the amount that a kid would get in a single vaccine while they're age 2. And that's a makeup day. Kids get 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 vaccines on a makeup day. So Neil Miller's reference, the book that was referenced, he also has a study that the use of combined vaccines in a single day is not safe. That's because most of the morbidity and mortality that is reported in VAERS is associated with a vaccination event that involved more than one vaccine. So we're dealing with a lot of observations, I understand that, but the lack of the science is not the fault of the people who firsthand experience vaccine injury and death. I just came from Columbus, where we're fighting censorship in the United States on this very issue. I ran a conference on censorship. It's the second conference in censorship in Columbus, Ohio. And we're soon not going to be allowed to talk about vaccine risk if Dr. Richard Pan from California, for instance, has his way. It will be illegal to hold proceedings like this, which I congratulate you on holding. But, it is possible to induce autoimmunity and chronic illness with vaccine adjuvants if there's a genetic risk. We know that all human beings are not cookie cutters of each other, and the way that they find out vaccine risk is firsthand. It's just through social media now. They found each other and they say, hey, that happened to you too? Okay, so there's corroboration that way. But, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right?
Minutes.
Okay,
Not
one
seeing questions from
final...
other parties?
Oh, sorry. One final question then, and brings it back to the bill. So, based on your actually last comment, would you be anti-vaccine or anti-mandatory or anti-scheduling?
Okay, great question, and thanks for bringing it up. I don't want to say what I'm for or against, because I'm not, I don't want to say what I'm against, I'm going to say what I'm for. It's a philosophy of mine, if that's okay. Vaccine exemptions are a safety valve in the vaccine program. They're absolutely necessary because the population will rise up when the 2 or 3% that you vaccinate experience 100% vaccine injury rate. It will become absolutely undeniable. Is the benefit of the incremental 1, 2, 3% By taking away the religious and philosophical exemptions, is that worth the human pain and suffering that's going to happen in this, in scientific terms, in the population that's enriched for risk? They vaccinate, and then they get hurt. They say, I don't want to vaccinate, and then they're penalized. It's a safety valve. So, you know, it's good to have these exemptions around so that people can make up their own mind based on experience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Your presentation is certainly appreciated. And